On the morning of May the 2nd, 2026, three Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy vessels, a Type 055 destroyer, a Type 054A frigate, and a replenishment ship, crossed into the contested waters of the South China Sea and held a heading that every analyst at the Pentagon immediately understood was not a routine patrol. It was a message, and the message was this: China does not recognize your blockade. China does not fear your carriers. And China is prepared to prove it. This is where everything changes. To understand what is happening right now, you have to go back to the weeks before this, when the United States and its coalition partners, Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and a nervous but committed South Korea, began the most aggressive naval encirclement operation the Pacific has seen since the Second World War. Washington called it Operation Straight Assurance. Beijing called it an act of war, dressed in bureaucratic language. The Chinese Foreign Ministry's statement was unusually blunt, using the word provocation 7 times in a single paragraph, which, for anyone who has read Chinese diplomatic communication for the past 20 years, is essentially a klaxon going off in a quiet room, because Beijing doesn't use that word lightly. Beijing uses that word when it has already decided what comes next and is simply informing the world before it happens. The origins of this crisis stretch back further than most people realize, and they are rooted not in military posturing, but in something far more combustible: economics. According to IMF estimates released in early 2026, China's GDP growth had slowed to 1%, the weakest figure in over 3 decades outside of pandemic years. Export revenue had been battered by cascading tariff regimes that the United States and European Union coordinated through a mechanism the Financial Times called the most sophisticated economic siege in modern history. Semiconductor restrictions had bitten so deeply into China's manufacturing pipeline that several major technology firms were quietly relocating supply chain operations to Vietnam and Malaysia, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other viable option. The internal economic pressure on Xi Jinping's government was immense, and it was getting worse every quarter. But here is what the financial pages don't tell you. What the Bloomberg terminals and IMF projections don't fully capture is the political chemistry inside Zhongnanhai, the compound in Beijing where China's leadership makes its decisions. Because when an authoritarian government faces internal economic pain of this scale, it doesn't sit still. It looks outward. It finds a theater. It manufactures a moment of nationalist theater that reframes the domestic narrative from "our economy is struggling" to "our nation is under siege and we are fighting back." Well, Xi Jinping has studied how this works. He has watched how it worked for others. And in the first months of 2026, with unemployment among Chinese youth hovering near 19% according to figures that analysts believe are themselves undercounted, the pressure to produce that moment had become overwhelming. Taiwan was always the obvious flashpoint, but what most Western analysts missed, and what Al Jazeera's Beijing correspondents began flagging in late March 2026, was that the immediate trigger was not Taiwan itself. It was the shipping lanes. Specifically, it was the United States Navy's decision to conduct what it described as a freedom of navigation enhancement operation through the Taiwan Strait in coordination with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, 2 carrier strike groups, simultaneous passage, coordinated with a Philippine naval presence in the South China Sea that was explicitly described by Manila as a sovereign patrol, language that Washington had clearly drafted and Manila had clearly accepted. The message was unmistakable. The United States was demonstrating that it could project overwhelming naval power in China's maritime backyard at will, and more critically, that it had assembled a coalition willing to stand beside it. China's initial response was measured but pointed. The PLA conducted what it called combat readiness exercises in the East China Sea, deploying a significant Air Force component that Defense News described as the largest single-day sortie of Chinese military aircraft in recorded history. Over 150 combat aircraft operating simultaneously across 4 separate exercise zones. The war zone reported that several of these aircraft came within what it described as uncomfortable proximity to Japanese air defense identification zones in ways that were clearly deliberate, clearly documented, and clearly designed to be reported. China was speaking through action, but Washington did not blink, and that is when Operation Straight Assurance moved from planning to execution. The United States, working through its treaty network with a speed that caught Beijing's intelligence apparatus partially off guard, assembled what Reuters described as a maritime coordination framework, which is diplomatic language for a soft blockade. Not a legal blockade in the traditional naval definition, which would require a declaration of war, but a coordinated pattern of naval presence, interdiction capability, and monitoring that would effectively give the coalition leverage over Chinese commercial shipping at key strategic choke points: the Strait of Malacca, the Lombok Strait, the Sunda Strait, the Bashi Channel. Every major maritime corridor through which Chinese energy imports and export goods must pass was suddenly thick with coalition naval assets operating under various legal authorities: freedom of navigation, bilateral defense agreements, UN maritime law provisions. Washington had essentially built a pressure architecture around China's maritime dependency without ever calling it what it was. Because here's the core vulnerability that the Biden administration identified and the subsequent administration has now fully weaponized. China imports roughly 73% of its crude oil by sea. 73%. According to figures from the International Energy Agency, cross-referenced with Bloomberg shipping data, approximately 11 million barrels of oil per day flow into Chinese ports via maritime routes, a significant portion of which transit through exactly the choke points where coalition naval assets are now concentrated. This is not a minor logistical inconvenience. This is an existential pressure point, and Beijing knows it. They have known it for years, which is why the concept of Malacca dilemma has been a fixture of PLA strategic planning documents since at least 2003. The fear was always that an adversary could strangle China's economy without firing a single shot simply by controlling the sea lanes. That fear is no longer theoretical. But that's not even the most dangerous part. The most dangerous part is what China's military planners believe they must do in response to prevent this vulnerability from becoming permanent. Because if China accepts, even tacitly, even temporarily, that the United States can establish this kind of maritime architecture, they have essentially conceded the strategic argument. They have acknowledged American primacy in the Pacific in a way that would be domestically catastrophic for Xi Jinping and institutionally catastrophic for the Communist Party's claim that China has risen to peer status with the United States. This is why the ships sailed on May 2nd. This is why there was no announcement, because the announcement would have invited a response. Moving silently was itself the response. The Type 055 destroyer at the head of the formation is a vessel worth understanding, because it represents something specific about where China's military is right now. Defense analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies have described the Type 055 as one of the most capable surface combatants currently operating anywhere in the world. It carries a vertical launch system with 112 cells. It has advanced air defense capabilities, anti-ship missiles, and anti-submarine warfare systems that have closed a gap with American destroyers that analysts estimated would take China another decade to close. It closed it in 5 years. The speed of Chinese naval modernization has been one of the most consequential and underreported military developments of the past decade, and the United States Navy knows it. The internal assessments are not comfortable reading. At the exact same time the Chinese formation was moving, something else was happening in Washington that most of the media coverage missed entirely because it was happening in classified briefings and closed-door committee sessions, rather than on the surface of public discourse. The National Security Council was receiving updated intelligence assessments about the state of China's internal decision-making, and what those assessments described was not a confident, unified government moving with strategic coherence. What they described was a leadership circle under enormous pressure, fractured along lines that had been forming for years, with figures in the PLA and the civilian establishment disagreeing sharply about how far to push this confrontation. According to sources described by the Financial Times as senior officials with knowledge of the briefings, and these things leak, they always leak, there was genuine concern inside Beijing that Xi Jinping had committed to a posture that his military was not certain it could sustain if the United States chose to escalate rather than accommodate. This is where the psychological dimension of this crisis becomes as important as the military one. Because what Washington is attempting to do, and this is the sophisticated part of the strategy that often gets lost in the drama of ship movements and military exercises, is not to defeat China in a naval engagement. It is to force China into a position where the costs of confrontation clearly exceed the costs of accommodation without ever triggering the actual confrontation. This is coercive diplomacy operating through military presence. The goal is not war. The goal is to make Xi Jinping blink, and to make the blinking look to the Chinese domestic audience like strategic restraint rather than strategic retreat. This is an extraordinarily difficult needle to thread, and whether Washington can actually pull it off is genuinely uncertain. The economic dimension of this is accelerating in ways that are creating real-time pressure on Beijing's decision-making. Oil tankers insured by Western insurers, which is the vast majority of the global tanker fleet, because Lloyd's of London and the major European marine insurers dominate the market, began receiving what the industry described as enhanced risk assessments for routes through contested waters. This is the language of insurance, but what it means in practice is that premiums spiked dramatically for vessels operating in the South China Sea corridor. According to Bloomberg, freight rates for tankers on the key Persian Gulf to China route increased by approximately 40% in the 2 weeks following the announcement of coalition naval operations. 40%. That is a number that finds its way immediately into the cost calculations of Chinese state energy companies, Chinese manufacturers, Chinese ports. The economic signal was being sent at every level simultaneously. Iran, which had been watching this situation with a particular attention of a country that has its own complex economic relationship with China, found itself in a position that was more constrained than it appeared from the outside. Beijing had been Iran's most important economic partner during the years of American sanctions, purchasing Iranian oil at discounted rates and providing diplomatic cover in international forums. But as the pressure on China mounted, as the cost of maintaining that relationship became something Chinese planners had to weigh against their own vulnerability, the warmth of that partnership began to show its limits. According to Reuters correspondents in Tehran, there were quiet signals from Beijing that China needed to reduce the visibility of its Iranian oil purchases, at least temporarily, to avoid providing additional justification for American pressure. Iran, which had positioned itself as having a reliable great power patron, was discovering that great power patrons have their own calculations that do not always include your interests. This is the hidden architecture of American strategy. By generating pressure on China through the maritime choke points, Washington was also indirectly generating pressure on everyone who depended on China as a backstop: Iran, Russia's remaining Asian trade relationships, North Korea's economic survival. The chain of pressure was not accidental, it was designed. And defense analysts report that the planning for this operation began not weeks ago, but over a year ago, in the quiet offices of think tanks and combatant commands and interagency working groups, where the actual strategic thinking of the United States government happens invisibly before it erupts into headlines. What happened next shocked even the analysts who had been tracking this most closely. Because on May 3rd, the day after the Chinese formation sailed, the United States did something that nobody in Beijing had quite anticipated. Rather than intercepting the Chinese vessels, rather than escalating through direct naval confrontation, the USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, which had been positioned east of the Philippines in what everyone understood was a statement of presence, turned west, not toward the Chinese formation, away from it. It moved toward the Strait of Malacca. It joined the USS Theodore Roosevelt Strike Group that was already operating in the Indian Ocean approaches. And it announced, through a Pentagon press statement that was carefully worded to be accurate without being inflammatory, that the United States was conducting enhanced maritime security coordination with the Indian Navy and the Australian Surface Fleet in the eastern Indian Ocean. Do you understand what just happened? The United States didn't chase the Chinese ships. It walked away and locked the back door. It repositioned its forces not to confront the Chinese naval movement in the South China Sea, but to tighten the encirclement at the deeper level, the level of the energy supply. The Chinese formation had sailed defiantly into waters where the United States was not, because the United States had just moved to waters that mattered more. The strategic judo was breathtaking in its simplicity and its clarity. China had made a visible, dramatic move. Washington had made a quieter, more consequential one. In Beijing, this was understood immediately. The Global Times, which functions as a barometer of Chinese government sentiment when the government wants to communicate something without official attribution, published an editorial in the early hours of May 4th that used language that senior analysts described as uncharacteristically cautious. It still attacked American hegemony. It still described the coalition operations as illegal and provocative. But the specific claim that China would break any blockade with decisive force, which had appeared in multiple earlier editorials over the preceding weeks, was absent. Gone. Editors don't accidentally omit the most aggressive line in an editorial about military confrontation. That omission was a signal. Someone in Beijing had decided that the rhetoric of breaking the blockade needed to be walked back slightly, just slightly, while the situation was assessed. The Chinese economy was not going to wait for the situation to be assessed. The market signals were brutal. The Shanghai Composite fell 2% in a single session on May 4th, its worst single-day performance in over 18 months. Chinese energy futures spiked. The yuan came under immediate pressure. According to figures that AP reported from foreign exchange markets, China's central bank spent an estimated $20 billion in currency reserves in a single day attempting to defend the yuan's exchange rate, an intervention that was both expensive and only partially successful. The markets were pricing in a scenario where the maritime pressure translated into genuine supply disruption, and the math of that scenario was not comfortable for anyone holding Chinese assets. IMF estimates suggest that a sustained disruption to Chinese energy imports, even a disruption of 15 to 20%, which falls well short of a complete blockade, would reduce Chinese GDP growth by between 1 to 8 and 2, 4 percentage points over a 12-month period. In the current environment, where growth is already running at 1%. That is the difference between managed slowdown and economic crisis, between political stability and the kind of social pressure that authoritarian governments fear most, because it is diffuse and impossible to address through the tools of repression. You cannot arrest unemployment. You cannot detain food price inflation. You cannot disappear the anger of a middle class that expected to get richer and is instead getting poorer. Xi Jinping knows this. The people around him know this. And the Americans know that they know this. The diplomatic track was moving at the same time, but it was moving in ways that revealed the depth of the problem rather than offering obvious solutions. The Chinese foreign minister had requested emergency consultations with the UN Secretary General. The United States had been briefing its NATO allies and its Indo-Pacific partners simultaneously. Japan's prime minister gave a press conference that was measured in language but firm in substance, describing the coalition operations as essential for the maintenance of a rules-based maritime order. Language that was clearly coordinated with Washington because it tracks almost word for word with the phrasing used by the State Department earlier that same week. The alliance management was working. The coalition was holding. What was not working, at least not yet, was any mechanism for China to de-escalate without appearing to have been defeated. And this is the genuinely dangerous inflection point in a crisis of this nature, because governments can accept painful strategic realities. What they struggle to accept is the narrative of humiliation that accompanies a visible backdown under pressure. Xi Jinping cannot return to the Chinese people and say, "We sent warships to defy the American blockade, and then we came home because the Americans repositioned their carriers to the Indian Ocean, and it became clear we could not sustain our position." That is not a story that the Communist Party can tell and survive politically in its current form. So the question that Washington is working on right now in the classified backchannels and the backchannel backchannels is whether there is an off-ramp available that allows Beijing to accept the strategic reality while constructing a narrative of dignified restraint rather than strategic defeat. The answer to that question matters enormously because if the answer is no, if there is no face-saving mechanism, if the domestic political logic inside China demands escalation because backing down is simply not survivable, then the calculus changes entirely. Then you are no longer in the realm of coercive diplomacy. You are in the realm of genuine military crisis. And the Type 055 destroyer in the South China Sea is no longer a political statement. It is a military asset in a deteriorating security environment. Defense analysts report that the PLA has quietly moved to what several sources describe as an elevated readiness posture across its eastern and southern theater commands. Not a war footing, not quite, but a configuration that shortens the timeline between a decision to escalate and the physical capability to execute that escalation. The distance between deterrence and war is measured in hours, not days, when forces are positioned this way. At the exact same time, something was happening in the Philippines that added another dimension to an already complex situation. President Marcos had been briefed by American officials on the full scope of the maritime coordination operation, and he had signed off on it. But inside Manila, the political currents were more complicated. A faction within the Filipino military establishment, with its own historical relationships with China, built through years of economic engagement and quiet military-to-military contacts, was reportedly uncomfortable with how completely the Philippines had been drawn into the American strategic architecture. According to sources described by Al Jazeera as senior Filipino officials, there were internal discussions about whether Manila had adequate assurances from Washington about what would happen if Chinese forces conducted operations directly against Filipino assets in the South China Sea in retaliation for Filipino participation in the coalition. The Mutual Defense Treaty was cited, but treaty language and practical reality have sometimes diverged in moments of genuine crisis, and Manila wanted more than language. Washington provided more than language. What it provided, according to Defense News, was a significant augmentation of American military presence at Subic Bay, and at the expanded access agreements negotiated under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. Permanent presence, not rotational, not enhanced exercises. An explicit message to Beijing that any action against Filipino forces would constitute an action against American forces. This was the most direct American military commitment to a regional ally since the height of the Cold War, and it represented a deliberate choice to reduce American strategic ambiguity, the long-standing practice of leaving adversaries uncertain about exactly how the United States would respond to various scenarios. Washington was removing the uncertainty. It was saying, here is exactly where we stand. Russia's response to all of this was itself revealing. Moscow, which had been tracking the situation with the attention of a country that has its own complex and evolving relationship with Beijing, issued a statement through its foreign ministry that was rhetorically supportive of China's position, describing the coalition operations as destabilizing and contrary to international maritime law, but which contained none of the specific commitments or offers of practical cooperation that Beijing would have needed to alter the strategic equation. Russia is currently committed militarily and economically in Ukraine to a degree that leaves it with very limited capacity to project meaningful support into the Pacific theater. The statement was solidarity without substance, and Beijing understood exactly what it was. This left China more isolated than its leadership had anticipated or was comfortable publicly acknowledging. The narrative that Beijing had been constructing of a multipolar world in which China, Russia, Iran, and other powers represented a genuine alternative pole to American hegemony was running into the friction of reality. In the moment that actually mattered, when China needed its partners to provide something concrete, the partnership produced rhetoric. It produced editorials. It produced statements of concern. It did not produce warships in the Indian Ocean. It did not produce energy supply alternatives that could offset the maritime pressure. The multipolar coalition, in the crucible of actual strategic confrontation, was revealing itself to be considerably less cohesive than its members had implied in calmer times. The Chinese formation was still moving. The three ships continued their heading. They had not turned back. They had not adjusted course. And the world was watching to see what happened when they reached the edge of the zone where American and coalition naval assets were most concentrated. Because what happened there would define the next chapter of this crisis in a way that no diplomatic statement or economic sanction could. But here is what the cameras aren't showing you, what the satellite images don't capture, what the naval tracking apps that millions of people are now following obsessively cannot reveal. In the spaces between ships, in the encrypted communications channels and the back-channel phone calls and the quiet conversations between officials who have spent decades building the kind of trust that allows adversaries to talk to each other, even in moments of maximum tension, something was moving. Not quickly, not visibly, but moving. The question was whether it was moving fast enough, whether the mechanisms of de-escalation that both sides desperately needed, but neither side could publicly admit to needing, were capable of operating faster than the physical movement of ships toward a contact point. According to sources described by the Financial Times as individuals with knowledge of diplomatic back-channel communications, there had been contact, not at the level of heads of state, not at the level that would create a visible signal, but at the level of senior officials who understand that their job in moments like this is to keep options open rather than to close them. The contact was described as serious and substantive. It was also described as unresolved. Both of those things can be true simultaneously, and in this case, they are. What Washington is offering, through those channels, is a version of this. The coalition maritime operations can be modified in scope and in visibility if China commits to specific, verifiable changes in behavior. In its operations around Taiwan, in its support for entities subject to international sanctions, in its maritime claims in the South China Sea. The modifications would be real. The commitments would need to be real. But the modifications would also give Beijing something it could present domestically as the product of its own firmness, rather than its own capitulation. The warships sailed, the argument would go, and the Americans adjusted their posture. That is not entirely false. It is also not the whole truth. The whole truth is more complicated and more damaging to the narrative that Beijing needs. But in international relations, the whole truth is rarely the operating currency. China has until, and this is the date that every defense analyst and intelligence official is currently focused on, the morning of May 7th, 2026, when the Chinese formation is projected to reach a position that makes continued ambiguity about intent untenable. At that point, decisions will need to be made by commanders on those ships, by officials in Beijing, by the President of the United States, by the prime ministers and defense ministers of the coalition nations who have staked their credibility and their security on the assumption that Washington knows what it is doing and will see this through. The world has watched great power competition as theory for years. It has watched it as economics. It has watched it as technology rivalry and diplomatic maneuvering. It is now watching it as something more visceral and more immediate. As three Chinese warships holding a course through contested waters while the most powerful naval coalition ever assembled in the Pacific tightens its grip around the energy arteries that sustain the Chinese economy. The math of this confrontation is brutal. The stakes are enormous. And somewhere in the South China Sea, in the pre-dawn darkness of the first week of May 2026, a Chinese admiral is standing on the bridge of a Type 055 destroyer, watching the horizon, waiting for orders that will either pull his formation back or push it forward into a confrontation that neither side has fully prepared the world, or itself, for the consequences of. The countdown is running, and nobody knows how it ends. Sonnet 4. Six Claude is AI, and